The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, when the people pressed upon Jesus to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had ceased speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a great shoal of fish. And as their nets were breaking, they beckoned to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he was astonished, and all that were with him, at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. Henceforth you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boat to land, they left everything and followed him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So we are in this short period of ordinary time, wearing green, ordinary time just before Lent begins. It's this year in the Jubilee year, 7 perfect weeks. And this is week number 5. And we are blessed to see and encounter Jesus calling his first disciples and beginning to shift and change their minds and hearts. But we first have to go to our first reading today to understand what the church is communicating through these readings to us. We see from the prophet Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 2 and 3 to 8. This amazing revelation, this powerful apparition or vision that this very important prophet has. "I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple." So he sees God sitting on his throne in the temple in heaven. You can imagine this vision, seeing this eternal being in all his power and majesty and glory, seated there. And he says, and above him, the seraphim. So the special angels of the hierarchy of angels, of all the 9 different choirs of angels made, Satan was a seraphim. So it's the highest order of angels. And from the word seraphim, these angels were so close to the presence of God that they would self-combust. They will burst into flames. So if you Google seraphim and look for an image, you will see angels with fire around them. They were so close to the presence of God, that's where they are normally found. They have also 6 wings. So the prophet Ezekiel describes as well, prophet Daniel, book of Revelation, 6 wings, 3 sets of wings, one to cover their countenance, their feet, and one for flying, set for flying. So even though today we don't believe in angels, too bad. The scriptures tell us, hey, they're real. Doesn't mean because you don't see that they are not real. And there is God in his powerful presence on his throne, and the angels are in God's presence, speaking out, proclaiming to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And it says here, the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke from the incense. So we had incense this morning. And so that's the image that we have. A powerful God whose glory fills the whole earth. Seated at his throne in heaven, and his glory fills the whole earth. His power and majesty manifested on the earth. And then we see the prophet Isaiah. He says, hang on a moment. I know I'm a prophet, but I'm just a man, and I'm sinful, and I live among sinful people. You can't use me. And the angel takes with a pair of tongs a burning coal and places it on his tongue, and he says, now, behold, this has touched your lips. All your guilt is taken away, and your sin forgiven. And then the Lord speaks. Now that he has engaged the prophet, now that he has removed the sin, he says, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? So even here in this reading from the prophet Isaiah, we see that God is already alluding to his divine persons. Who shall go for us? And that's the background for our beautiful 2 readings from this gospel today, our gospel reading. And we are reflecting on Luke's gospel, it's chapter 5, and also from the letter of St. Paul, his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. We see the call of Peter and Paul telling us about how he has been called. So these 2 big, powerful apostles that have actually shaped the church through their ministry, we see their call. And the story is very powerful of Peter. You have to have a real alertness and an awareness of what is being communicated to us this morning through this gospel reading. Jesus first, he's by the lake of Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias, depending on from where you are standing around that lake and what you would like to call it. And he sees the 2 boats that had gone out and had already come back from fishing. And the men were already outside of the boat. They were cleaning the nets, preparing to put everything away. And he gets into one of the boats with Simon, which is Simon's. He just puts out a little to shore, away from the shore, and he begins to preach to the people and begin to talk to them and begin to explain to them. And once he had done the preaching to the people, he turns to Peter and he says, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Now, if you understand, these boats were just not casual, recreational boats. Peter was a fisherman. That was his work. That was his, let's say, career. He was a specialist in catching fish. And here comes Jesus, the son of a carpenter, and says to him, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And you listen to Peter's reply, "Master, we toiled all night, we worked all night, and we caught nothing." He could have said, "Who are you? I mean, you're a carpenter's son. How can you tell me, a fisherman, after I spent the whole night fishing?" And normally when the fishermen would go out on a lake, they would go out when the lake is calm and quiet, because then the fish come up to the surface to feed. And that's when they are caught. And they were fishing the whole night and they caught nothing. You don't fish during the day when there's traffic on the lake, when there's activity, when there's noise. They will just go deep underneath and they'll wait until night again. So who is this carpenter coming to tell this experienced fisherman, "Hey, have you caught anything? Let's go out into the deep, put your nets down for a catch"? Peter could have said to him, "You don't know anything about fishing, man. Just keep preaching." But what does Peter do? He says, "Master, we've toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word, I will let down the nets." But at your command. A very important shift for Peter. But because you tell me, and he qualifies, he says, "Master." Master of what? And of course we know the story. They let down the nets, and a great shoal of fish were caught. So much so that both the boats were full to capacity and were beginning to sink. And Peter knew this is what just happened now is impossible. There is no way they've ever caught so much fish. So he knew something happened here. And Peter drops down on his knees and he says, just leave me. I can see I'm in the presence of God and I'm so sinful. God, you don't know me. I'm just too sinful. Stay away from me. And the Lord's answer is, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. I can imagine that experience. It says here, when they got to the land, Peter left the boats and all the fish. He left everything and he followed Jesus. Here's the question. Some people leave everything and follow Jesus, yes? Some people leave Jesus and follow everything. What stands out about this story for me this morning is the obedience of Peter. Peter was prepared to obey the command, the word of Christ. And because of that obedience, his whole life was changed. In our second reading, Paul also tells us today that he was not just a sinner, but a rotten sinner, a murderer of Christians when God called him. A murderer of human beings. And God called him to be an apostle. So the call that God can place on the heart of a human being is not dependent on you. It is actually dependent on God. What is really important about you is, can you respond? That's the big question. For most people's lives on earth, they are either something very important to God, someone very important whom God uses, or someone who just disappears into the history of humanity and they become nobody. It all depends on, can they respond to God? Or can they just ignore God, be indifferent to God? That stands out about every single person's life as we journey through our own lives. If you are not prepared to respond to God, and especially to obey God, to obey what God is asking of you, you will definitely amount to nothing. It doesn't matter how successful we are, right? That day was probably the most successful catch of fish for Peter. It doesn't matter how successful you are in your career and your work. When God calls you to himself, it is always something better. It is always something more. He always takes you beyond what you think is success or greatness or achievement. That's God. He always takes you beyond your very limited view of what you think happiness will mean. Always. For Peter, all he knew was fishing. He caught fish, he sold it. He went out the next day, he caught fish, he sold it. He went out the next day, he caught fish, he sold it. But when he responded to Christ that day, his whole life changed. Everything about him changed. It was on that man that Jesus built his church. And we spoke about the church belonging to Jesus Christ this weekend. We have this image of God, the all-powerful, and we see him on his throne in the first reading from the prophet Isaiah. And we see him so powerful over nature that he, just at his word, just at his command, a massive haul of fish. You see his power manifested. Very often, and this has been probably the lesson for me this weekend, when God gives a person the privilege of encountering him, he is testing that person. That first step of encounter with God is always a test. God will never entrust you with any mission, with any task, with any responsibility, without you earning his trust. And it's always a test. The test for Peter was, at that moment when Jesus said, put out into the deep and let your nets down for a catch, Peter could have said no. And that same Peter we would never have known today. He would have been a nobody who would have lived and died. The test was, could he respond to the command and instruction of Jesus? Always a test. What has been the test for you this weekend? And whenever Jesus takes us to the next level, takes us a little deeper, he always places before that action of taking us deeper a test. Always. At least that's my experience as a priest. Whenever he's taking me deeper into my own journey with him, he always places a test. And trust me, I failed quite a number of tests, by the way. They're not easy. But he will always place a test before us. And like in the first reading from the prophet Isaiah, if we acknowledge our limitedness, our weakness, our sinfulness before God, if we drop down on our knees and say, God, are you sure you made the right decision? Are you sure you want me to do this thing? Just like Peter in that boat that day. If we are willing to say, hey, Lord, do you know how stupid I am? Do you know how many mistakes I've made? Are you sure you're talking to me? When we admit our weakness, our fault before God, he will do what he did with the prophet Isaiah. He will take the power that is his and purify and heal us of those things that are obstacles, of those things that are sins in our lives, so that he can transform us to be ready for mission. The mission of the prophet Isaiah was to go out and preach and transform the community. The mission of Peter was to become an apostle and eventually to be sent out to go and make disciples of all nations and to offer his life in sacrifice, which is what he did. Before being sent out on mission, you will be called, and that call will mean a test. You can ignore the call, or you can even listen to the call and fail the test. Quite something, eh? God will never send you out to do something important on his behalf if you are not prepared to find a way to pass the test. And that's for all of us here. Every one of us. And every test is as personal as the prophet Isaiah, and as personal as Peter, and as personal as St. Paul. The Lord wants us to make that effort, to recognize him as God, to obey him at his word, and to be prompt in the way we respond. Immediate response. Very often when we're young, this is the thing we say. Oh, Lord, not just yet, maybe in a few years, just give me some space, give me some time. That's what we say. And so we delay the response. But we don't know. Was that the only test for Peter? No. Peter was tested a number of times. That's just the first test. The first step of intimacy. The first small bit of mission that he would be granted. And with the Lord, that is always the case. There will be a number of moments that we draw closer and closer and closer to Jesus. I always feel so sad for those people who've just decided, I'll just ignore God. I'll just do my own thing and just live my life. I always feel, I wonder what would have happened in this person's life if they only obeyed God. I wonder what would have happened. What great things he could have done in that person's life. Very often I look at people and I think, sure, so much potential, so much indifference. What do we say? No, no, no. You don't understand, Father. This is actually not for me. It's for him. Or for her. But for me, no, 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 no. I can't do that. God can't ask me to do that. You don't know. God is the one sitting on the throne. He is the one who sees. And he sees everything. He knows what your future should be like. He knows. And so we ask him today, as we observe Peter and observe Paul and observe the prophet Isaiah, we ask him, Lord, I know I'm not worthy, but is there something that you want to say to me? Is there something that you want to do in my life? We should at least have the courage to ask that of the Lord. What is it that you need from me? I know I'm a nobody, but what do you need from me? The Lord always has, I believe, a mission for every single human being. Everyone. No one is left out. There are no stragglers. There are no spare wheels. Everybody is important for the story of salvation. We ask him this morning that as we celebrate this Holy Mass, for us to have this prompt obedience to his call. As soon as we know what God is asking of us, we ask the Lord to give us that courage to obey him so that we can begin this new journey, setting out into the deep, into our future, letting the nets down for a catch, and allowing his grace and his power to work in us. Amen.